1 Kings 11, and we'll begin reading in 41. And the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? In the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. Our Father in heaven, again, we appreciate the opportunities to hear your word. Every time is an opportunity. It's precious. We can recall days in history when the word of God was precious, meaning that they didn't have any. They couldn't find it. The enemy had tried to drown it or tried to burn it. And then here we are now with copies in our laps all over the place. So we're thankful for it. We don't take it for granted. But again, just because we have the copies, just because we have it, we don't take it again for granted that it would be powerful for us. So we do ask that it would be, that it would come across by power, resurrection power, as Paul said, that I may know the power of his resurrection. In Jesus' name, amen. As we turn the page here from chapter 11 to chapter 12, we recognize that there have been 3 crowns. That's all. 3 crowns. You had Saul, David, and now Solomon. 3 crowns, and within 100 years, the spiral would begin. And you think, if only they had known. And then somebody in these days, if we were to say that to them, if we could travel back to them here at this time, at around 900 and so, or 1000 BC, if we were to travel back, we could say, if only they had known. And the response would be, known what? So let's throw our ribbon in here and discuss that. And let's look back in Paul's epistle to his letter to the Romans and discuss the things that we would like them to know and the things that we need to know, or at least to refresh ourselves in this knowledge. When we come to Romans chapter 1, we know that Romans, this letter itself, is a dissertation on the doctrines of faith written by the Apostle Paul. Paul was a lawyer, so he writes and thinks as a lawyer. He talks as a lawyer. So the epistle will consist of case law, admissible facts, things that would be headed towards the courts. He writes it in a very judicial way. He states the facts. This is the evidence. And then we're going to walk over to the Gospels, and we're going to look how Jesus doesn't just deal with facts alone, but he reveals the roots of the facts, that he reveals the hearts of the men that are engaged in these facts. And then finally, we'll make our way back to the Kings, to our text, where in the Old Testament and in the Kings, it's just straight up actions within the kingdom. We don't have the revelation of the heart. We don't have the revelation of the Apostle Paul, but if we combine all 3 of these together, then we see the invisible kingdom on the print of the page there recorded for us in the Kings. So if you look at this, and we see the first of the indictments in chapter 1 and the reasons thereof starting out in verse 18, Romans 1:18. He says, and just lays out again the facts. This is his opening arguments as he buttons up his coat, straightens his tie, and heads towards the bench. He says, look, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Paul then stops and looks at the jury and looks at them and says, they know. Everyone knows. We know it, you know it, and they know it. Everyone, it says, knows the truth. They hold the truth, but they hold it in unrighteousness. They just don't like it. They know the truth, but they just don't like it. It says in verse 19, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. They know it. It's inside them, for God hath showed it unto them. And he kind of goes down through a downward spiral into verse 21. He says, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. Now look, it says, but became. They became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And I would stop and say, what is the process of that? What does the process look like as in real time as they became bad? As the spiral was taking place, when their heart was foolish and became darker and darker, and their imaginations became more vain, what was the process that looked like? Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Again, what does that look like? It says, and they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, to birds, four-footed beasts, creeping things. They just were way out in left field. It was the spiral, but what did the transition look like? And how can we recognize the transition when it's happening? So that we can maybe put a stop to it midway before it actually reaches the epitome in verse 24. Because verse 24 is a terrible sentence. Wherefore, because of the transitioning and the process and the declension, because of that, it says God also gave them up. And he repeats this in his opening arguments, Paul does. If you look over in verse 26, he says again, for this cause God gave them up. Verse 28, he repeats it again in mid-sentence. God gave them over to a reprobate mind. He repeats it over and over. God gave them up. It is the removal of restraints. You don't want the restraints? Then I'll reduce the restraints. God, by grace, restrains sin. It's by his grace, really, and we know this. If it wasn't for his grace, all of us, we would be in a horrible situation. I mean, there has been times we know for sure we were heading whether it's in the car, in a car accident, or just making bad decisions, or, whatever. You can look back in your life and think, man, I almost made a terrible decision. And for some reason, I didn't. What we need to know here as we look at this letter in the beginning is grace begets grace. That grace causes graciousness. Likewise, then, the opposite is sin begets sin. And so the problem is, the danger is that sin is an exponential threat. Here we know the facts, but we can see that it starts small, the sin, and it snowballs into something so great that it's out of control, downhill avalanche, till finally God says, you know what, you're on your own, and then over the cliff it goes, and societies crumble. We see world empires that absolutely collapse, and you see them no more because of this. It's colossal. It takes down world empires. Sin. So here we have the facts that Paul says that to watch out for, the fact that of a snowball coming. Now let's examine the heart then, which Jesus does in Luke chapter 7. There's an interesting little tidbit here because it's early in the ministry, and early on in Jesus' ministry, people were actually giving him the benefit of the doubt. It wasn't later on where they just wrote him off and said, forget that, that's not what we want. But here early on, it's like, Jesus is, like I have this cat at home that is absolutely schizophrenic, and it doesn't kill mice with his claws or teeth. She's schizophrenic enough that she plays with them enough till finally they die of mass cardiac arrest, and then they just lay down and die. Jesus plays with people. He knows their heart. He's only examining it and revealing it to them. He already knows. So what we see is we have him now, it's early on in the ministry, and he's dealing with either the acceptance or the rejection of John the Baptist and his early ministry as the forerunner of the king. And so we jump in Luke 7, verse 30. He says, but the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the counsel of God against themselves, which is so sad. They don't realize that they oppose themselves. They are the leadership. They are the men of the cloth, but they don't get it. And so they weren't baptized of John. So the Lord then brings out something concerning this. Verse 31, the Lord said, whereunto then shall I liken the men of this generation? Now notice the words that he uses. He doesn't use, whereunto then shall I liken the people? He doesn't say even the group of people. But rather, he says, whereunto shall then I liken the men of this generation? And to what are they like? Well, and he explains, they are like unto children sitting in the marketplace. And so what he is doing is he's making a societal culture. He's wrapping it all up in one envelope. It is the polis of the metropolis. It is the general mentality of the populace. This is the way that the whole generation thinks. This is their polis. This is the way they all walk and talk. They wear the same clothes. They say the same lingo. They basically think the same way. And you notice this when you look through history. If you have the opportunity, which you probably will not any longer, but if you happen to be watching the Sin Box and on comes on Happy Days, and you hear the music, and you're like, good night, now that's music. You don't hear that anymore. And you certainly will not see the Fonz rolling around on you just don't see that anymore. You don't see Joni and Chachi, and it was a different culture, totally different. This is what Jesus is saying. Whereunto shall then I liken the men of this generation? And then he says, well, they are like children sitting in the marketplace, in where all the hustle and bustle is, where business is done. We're talking about the ordinary folks. Look, he says, and calling one to another, saying, we have piped unto you, and you have not danced. Well, the message was given in a way of music and positive. We played you music for you, but you didn't respond. You didn't dance. We tried the positive way. So then that didn't work. So let's try the negative way, the opposite. We have mourned to you, but you have not wept. It's just both ends of the spectrum. We tried everything and doesn't seem to pan out. To verse 33, for John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a devil. No, we don't want John the Baptist because he is the independent, fundamental King James Baptist person who always has his boots on. Nah, he's too harsh. We don't like him at all. He's way legalistic, homeschools his kids, dude. I mean, he's just out there in the desert wearing crazy stuff, eating locusts and beans. No. We can't have him. Oh, okay, well then the other side of the spectrum. The Son of Man is come, eating and drinking, and you say, oh no, we can't have him. He's a gluttonous man and a winebibber. He's friends of publicans and sinners. We can't have him. He's like, he stands at the wine line too long. He's at the wine bibber, he's got we can't. No. No, he's too friendly. But wisdom is justified of all her children. What does that mean? Well, you're going to find out that verse 34 is exactly linked to 1 Kings 12. So what happens now is a man comes to the cardiac care unit, and he comes ambling in, and the doors, they slide open automatically, and he's nervous. He's got heart problems. He knows things aren't right. So he finally, he's a man. He's been putting it off for like 3 years already, until finally now his arm is numb, and he's barely limping in, and then he comes as a typical guy into the cardiac unit. He's in need of open heart surgery by now, and he's about to get it. One of the Pharisees, verse 36, desired him, Jesus, that he would eat with him. Oh, really? And he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. How gracious Jesus was, because he knows who this is. Verse 37, and look what happens. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought in an alabaster box of ointment. And we're familiar with this one. This is a popular story. He stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with ointment. I mean, this is astonishing. And here we go. You can see the man now. He's prepped. He has the gown on. He's laying on the table, and they have him fully sedated. They have him turned to the side. The ribs are cracked open. The blood is being totally diverted from the heart through pumps. And you can see the surgeon's first glance at his heart. Now when the Pharisees which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet. Now this is just his thought. This is just his heart. This is not being said. But Jesus is the surgeon. This man, Jesus, if he were a prophet, he would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touches him, because she is a sinner. The doctor knows exactly what he's thinking, because he sees the open heart. And Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have something to say to you. Okay, master, say on. And he tells this story. Verse 41, there was a certain creditor which had 2 debtors. The one owed 500 pence, the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered, I said, I suppose he to whom he forgave most. Jesus responds, thou hast rightly judged. Now here comes the scathing report, the brutal honesty. And if you can see them in here sitting in this room, because Jesus communicates perfectly as the master, because look what he does. It says that he turned, in verse 44, he turned to the woman and says to Simon, that is unique. That is the art of Jesus at his finest. He's not even looking at Simon. He's only looking at this sinner woman. And look what he says. Seest thou this woman? Do you see her? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman, you can hear him say, this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore, I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for or because she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. She's full aware of her sin. It's like David, my sin is always before me. She knows she's a sinner. It bites at her conscience. She knows it. She's full aware. And love then, because of this, Jesus says, love grows because of grace. Because she's aware of her sin, she experiences grace abundantly. And because that, she loves more. Because grace causes graciousness. If you've been shown grace, you know what it's like to be in a position where I'm guilty. And God has shown me grace. And it's easier then to show other people grace because I've been shown grace. So grace begets grace. But he, the Pharisee, he doesn't think he sins. I don't sin. Now, we know he does, but he don't think so. Oh, no. I don't sin. I live in the quaint little town of Hudson, Ohio, and I make over six figures, and my kids all go to Hudson school. All of them have that 3-point grade point average. And in fact, my wife drives a Volvo. I don't sin. So less sin, less grace. Less grace, less graciousness. That's what Jesus is saying. But you think to yourself, wait a minute though, because this guy here that we're dealing with, this Pharisee, he's not just anybody. He's a leader of society. He's a Pharisee. He has a lot of influence over people. What he thinks and what he does actually affects society. Remember that the story begins in this generation, in the marketplace. And how does the marketplace turn? How do we go from 1950s era to 1970s era to now? How does it spiral down? How does that happen? What is that process of spiral and declension? Well, we see it right here. Because the leaders of society have influence, and in this case, it's bad. It's called communication. Public communication. Means a lot. So, yesterday was one of the days in my neighborhood that we communicate. I have some redneck hillbilly lives behind my house, probably a couple hundred acres through the woods, and on a Friday night or sometimes in the middle of the day, sometimes in the middle of the night, the guy just starts shooting off rounds of guns. And, I can hear him bang, bang, bang. And you hear him way off in the distance. He's shooting and then sometimes he gets carried away and he lights off fireworks in the middle of the night. I mean, it's like bang, 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 and all kind of, So what I did yesterday as he was doing this is, I'm in my chair and I'm rocking back and forth with my King James in front of me, and I decided, So I turn around and I pull the gun out of the holster that's sitting right by my desk, and I walk outside and I blast off a couple of rounds too. You know what I was communicating? I hear you. And now you hear me. That is what we need to do. I hear them, and now he hears me. It's called public communication, and it has to do with either a spiral down or a spiral up. And that is what is happening in 1 Kings 12. Go there. Actually, we'll back up into chapter 11 just to make the connection between the chapters. In 1 Kings 11, we have the death of Solomon. This is the end of a reign. And we are full aware of what takes place afterward, but they weren't. They don't know. This is new to them. This is only their third king. And the first king was a disaster. King David was fantastic. Solomon starts out, I mean, he is like the wisest person in all the world save Jesus Christ. And he's dead. We do have a key to understanding the whole chapter of 12. The key to that chapter is verse 42 of chapter 11, though. Because in that verse, it says, "And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years." That is a key verse to know the next chapter. 40 years he reigned. That's how long his administration was. It's a big deal. 40 years. 4 decades. Where were you 40 years ago? That's half of our life. So there's key. So let's get at it then. Chapter 12, verse 1. It says, "And Rehoboam," this is his son, "went to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king." That's your normal dynasty rule. The seed of the king, his son, is coming up and will then take the crown. But we have problems. Verse 2, "It came to pass when Jeroboam," now let me just stop here to help us all as far as Bible stuff goes, because we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. That's too close. You start reading this, you're like, wait a minute, who's Jeroboam? Who's Rehoboam? And then you get them confused, like Rehoboam and Jeroboam and Boam. So let me just help you. Rehoboam, reverse. He's the son of Solomon. He is of the old guard. Jeroboam is the new guard. He is not son of the king. Just a little helper there. So every time you see Rehoboam, you reverse to Solomon. You're going back. And that helps me out because, sometimes I'm like, oh, wait, I don't even know what I'm reading here. Let's go back. So that was just, a help. Rehoboam, reverse, so we're talking of Solomon's son. Rehoboam goes to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king. All right, we're good. But then in 2, well, it came to pass when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who was yet in Egypt, heard of it. Now look at this is important too, a little parenthetical. "For he was fled from the presence of King Solomon, and Jeroboam dwelt in Egypt." There's a thread there. It's a very bad thread, yet a thread. Because if you just go back into chapter 11, you'll see something that's similar. In chapter 11, verse 17, we have a guy named Hadad, just some guy. He flees too. And notice the similarity, though, that Hadad fled. This is 1 Kings 11:17. Hadad fled, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him go into Egypt, Hadad being yet a little child. They're seeking refuge. They're seeking safety and shelter. And where do they go to find it? Egypt. Now, that's a thread that you'll find throughout Scripture. Abraham and Sarah, they run into problems. Where do they flee to? Egypt. Later on, Jacob and his family, they flee. Where do they flee for refuge? Egypt. Go to the New Testament. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. Jesus is a baby. Herod is a vicious king. Where do they flee to for refuge? Egypt. Egypt, though, brothers, is a picture of the world. The world are wine bibbers. Friend of publican and sinners. Sometimes, brothers, if we're honest, the beer drinkers are better than believers. If we're honest. Because a lot of the brothers and sisters are too busy with their combat boots always on. And so here we have men fleeing for refuge from Israel to Egypt. That is very sad. That doesn't happen here. We are a band of misfit toys, all of us. And we know it. Verse 2 of chapter 12, and it came to pass when Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who was yet in Egypt, heard of it, for he was fled from the presence of King Solomon. And Jeroboam dwelt in Egypt. Then verse 3, that they sent and called him. Now who's the they? The they are the citizenry that worked in town. They are the general populace that knew who Jeroboam was. He was an employee of the king. He was a person of the gates. He was mighty in valor. The Bible says that he was industrious. He was a leader of influence. He was a good guy. They liked him, and he worked around, and he went in and out of the people. He was a person of the populace, and they liked him. And so now what we have is, by God's hand, though, don't forget, we have a problem because Solomon has been told that you're going to have, your whole empire is going to be divided because of your sin. So he's coming to get a crown. But then look what happens to this refugee named Jeroboam. They, the citizenry, sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel, they come. And they spake unto Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, saying, here's the message. We're having this big transition of power, and we have a talk. We have communication. Look what they say in 4. Thy father made our yoke grievous. And somebody would say, wait a minute. What? Wasn't the father that you're talking about? Isn't that Solomon? I mean, the hero Solomon? The one who had all the wisdom, who didn't pray for money or gold, but because he prayed for wisdom, God gives him a second dose, and God blesses him to the point where all the world, he gives tax and tribute to Solomon. The wisest man under the sun. Remember the whole story where the two wives are like, well, that's my kid. And she's like, no, that's my kid. And, and he's like, bring me a sword. And they're like, what an amazing amount of wisdom this guy has. And then even the queen of Sheba of the south comes just to hear his wisdom. This is Solomon. But look how he's described here. Your father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore, make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke which he put upon us, the citizenry, lighter, and we will serve you. They're coming to the administration that's incoming saying, don't do like your dad who, if you just treat us with respect and dignity, and we'll serve you. Verse 5, he said unto them, okay, depart yet for 3 days, then come again to me. And the people departed. And King Rehoboam consulted, now look at this. King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, consulted with the old men that stood before Solomon his father while he yet lived. Again, the old guard. And said, how do you advise that I may answer the people? Good question. They responded and said, they spake unto him, saying, if thou wilt be a servant unto this people this day, and will serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be thy servants forever. This, my friend, is the absolute precipice of history. For a nation divided cannot stand, and this is the pinnacle. Choose wisely. He calls for advisors, rightfully so. The old men that stood in Solomon's court. If you just serve them. It's frigidly cold outside. We have no place to park. We have to plow the grass because there's no place to park. I learned something years ago. You know how you can learn something from people who do things wrong just as much as you can learn from people who do things right? I loved my pastor. Well, we had a rocky relationship. It was a little bit tumultuous at times, but at the end of the day, I did care for him. He had a sign that said, Dr. I can't even say his name because that would be bad. Front row parking. I said, that is not biblical. I didn't say that. I just thought it. It's freezing cold outside. We got to plow the grass. I park down by the street and walk all the way up. Because I honestly believe that all of you folks, that I am your servant. I'll walk for you. That way you can park close. No, that's no kudos to me. That's just Bible. That's what we're talking about here. Right? Besides that, some of you guys haven't figured out yet that you need a four-wheel drive. So you'll get stuck parking in the grass. So there's that too. The old men told him, if you will be a servant unto this people this day and will serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, they will be thy servants forever. There will be loyalty and graciousness, even when you sin, because you will. But he forsook the counsel of the old men, which they had given him, and consulted with the young men that were grown up with him, and which stood before him. Now, here's the key that we have to go back to the previous chapter, in chapter 11, verse 42. Because if you notice here, you have to look at the timeline. Verse 42 says, and the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Which means then that the young men never experienced the glory days of Solomon. All they know is the yoke that is heavy and grievous. They never experienced a kingdom that is gracious and wise and loving and caring. They never experienced that. They don't know. All they know is the latter half. But the old men, they remember the way it used to be. And they tell him, seek the old paths. You can hear the prophet Jeremiah, can't you? Seek the old paths. Verse 9, he said unto them, what counsel give you that we may answer this people? He's talking to the young people who have spoken to me, saying, make the yoke which thy father did put upon us lighter. And the young men that were grown up with him spake unto him, saying, thus shalt thou speak unto the people that spake unto thee, saying, thy father made our yoke heavy, but make it lighter unto us. Thus shalt thou say unto them, my finger shall be thicker than my father's loins. And now, whereas my father did laid you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father hath chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. It is the demise of the superpower of the world. Where did they learn this behavior? Where did they learn this? From Solomon in his old age. They did not know. They did not love God. Solomon did not love God in the end. And because he did not love God, he did not know his own sin. Because I don't sin. But to him that much is forgiven, loves much. See, don't you ever sit back in your chair, in your office, when you're reading the Bible and be like, God, it's me. And you just sit there. Sometimes it's like, I feel like Job sitting in the ash heap. And then it automatically does turn over to grace. He loves me anyway. How can that be? How can he love a sinner like me? Because he didn't know his own sin. He doesn't know grace. And grace begets grace. But here, sin has begotten sin. And all will be lost. There's no hope. He will lose the kingdom. But there is hope, brothers. There's always hope. Turn ye from your sin, and he is quick to forgive. And then you can sit back, forgiven, and in so doing, you fulfill the greatest commandment that there is. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength. And you don't have to conjure it up. It's there. And sometimes when you're in your prayer time or your meditation time or whatever it is, you just say, hey, God, I love you. Thanks for loving me when I was unlovable.